most modern. So the core technology underlying most modern AI systems at this point is large language models. And broadly, these are a type of neural network that take in text and in the current iteration, predict and generate more text based on the provided input. And so how do we actually build these systems? There's three main phases that go into constructing them. The first is pre-training, the second is instruction tuning, and the third is usually some kind of reinforcement learning. In the pre-training stage, what happens is we take a really large corpus of raw, unlabeled data. And what I mean by this is no one has gone through and sort of annotated what text is good and what text is bad. It's just a straight like dump of text data. And we take this text and we feed it into the model. And so some examples of these kinds of data sets is this is where you see if you've read that like these models are trained on the whole internet, like this is what's happening in the pre-training phase. We basically take a dump of the internet, some amount of filtering goes on to decide what exactly to include, and then the model gets trained on this data. And just to give you a sense of scale, Common Crawl, one of the large data sets that is a dump of the internet, has about 250 billion web pages, whereas English Wikipedia, the entire English Wikipedia is around 60 million web pages. So this is sort of like a common question is like, why don't we use more trusted sources for training AI? It's like orders of magnitude, not enough data if you try to restrict sources. The way these models actually get trained on this data is they get fed the text one token at a time, and they're trained to predict what is the most likely next token in the sequence. And so what this might look like is something like this. We give the model the man went to, and then we train the model to predict the store comes after that. And we can do this for each sequence in our data set. And in this pre-training process, the model what we've learned and can see in how these models function is that the model encodes a lot of useful information about language and also things like facts and information that occur in the data set. But at this point, the model's only trained to just predict the next most likely token. So if we take a model that's only been pre-trained in this way and nothing else, an example of this is GPT-3, which is model released before ChatGPT, and we prompt it with explain the moon landing to a 6-year-old in a few sentences. If you give this prompt to ChatGPT, it's probably going to give you a reasonably good description of the moon landing. If you give this prompt to a model that's only been trained with pre-training, these are the kinds of outputs you get. It's not actually trained to follow the instructions, it's just trying to predict the next most likely token. So to get to the point of a model that can actually follow instructions, we have another training phase that's typically called instruction tuning, might more broadly be called supervised fine-tuning. And in this phase, what we do is we take basically exactly examples of what we want the model to do. So we take pairs of here's an instruction or here's a question and here is the output that we want the model to produce. And then we train the model given this input, here's the output, and update the model to get closer towards producing the output that we want. And this data typically needs to be written by hand. Like someone went through and said, here is the question and here is the correct answer to this question. So this is different than the pre-training data. These days, you're more and more getting, increasingly people are trying to automate this kind of data creation and like train smaller models on outputs from bigger models and these kinds of things. But somewhere in the pipeline, someone probably had to write out what was the answer we wanted, right? And the last training phase is reinforcement learning. And canonically, this is typically a specific type of reinforcement learning called reinforcement learning from human feedback, though there's a lot of other variants as well. This is typically the training phase when people talk about aligning AI or aligning language models. They're usually talking about this phase. Sometimes people include both the instruction tuning and reinforcement learning in the term alignment. And in this training, what we do is we take outputs from a model and these outputs get scored as either being good or bad, like, yes, this is the output we want, or no, it's not the output we want. And then we just feed that reward signal back into the model. So this is different than the instruction tuning phase in that we're not giving the model the example of the answer that we want. We're just telling the model this is good or this is bad and using that to update. And what this kind of looks like in practice The way this is often done is we take two different versions of outputs from the model and we ask someone to rate which version is better. And then we use those ratings to train a model that predicts those scores, like given two outputs, predict which one's better. That's called a reward model. And we use the reward model to then update our model to produce outputs that people like. And so this is kind of the last training phase. So a lot of the behavior that you might see in models, these tendencies like the model produces the model practices syncopacy, like it tends to agree with whatever the user says. And if you tell the model it's wrong, it apologizes, right? A lot of that gets trained in at this phase. And you can see like that's clearly not, like this model's clearly not doing that, right? So it's not inherent to these models that they have to act that way. It's getting actively trained into them during this reinforcement learning or more broadly alignment phase. So that's kind of bare technology that underlines most of these systems. Increasingly, especially so in the last year, often these large language models, the models that take the text inputs and produce text outputs, are getting integrated in other kinds of systems. So now, if you interact, it depends what platform you're using and what level of, did you pay for the pro plan or using free tier or whatever. But many of them are basically hooked up to internet searches. And so you type your prompt to the model sends that prompt to a retriever system that runs a search on the internet, identifies relevant web pages, and then provides those web pages and your question again to the large language model that we just built to produce a final answer. So a lot of times you're getting more kind of integrated backend in these systems. This a fun anecdote. After ChatGPT was released, I had this running conversation with my dad for about a year in which every time I talked to him, he said, it's doing a Google search. And I'd say, it's not doing a Google search. It's not how these models are built. That's not what they do. And then now, a year later, most of them actually are doing Google searches. So he turned out to be right. And the other places where we see this is you might have connections to systems that are not just the internet. So if you're working with models that do code generation, they might actually have access like to your computer and they can run jobs. And so you give the prompt to the model, that goes to a language model generates code and then executes that code by accessing your computer. So in this pipeline, I like to break down this development pipeline into these kind of 5 components. And I started using this phrasing when we were looking at like surveys of particularly of racism in pipeline developments, but I think it's a useful way of thinking about the components of these models. And so specifically in this, we have the data that gets fed into the models. We have labels on that data. So that's coming in your instruction tuning and reinforcement learning phases. You're not just looking at raw data itself. Someone went through and hand labeled what the data is or should be. Then you have the actual model itself. So this is basically a giant sequence of arrays of numbers that get multiplied and added together in various ways to produce outputs. You have the outputs themselves, and then finally you have how those outputs get used. And I think it's really important to distinguish between those things. A raw model output by itself doesn't really do anything. How someone interprets and acts on that output is what actually kind of has impact. And then when we think about the pipeline in this way, it should be really obvious that there's people involved in all of these steps, right? Data doesn't come from nowhere. Even if it's just pulled from the internet, someone wrote that data, someone labeled that data. Even the models themselves, it's people who made decisions about how big they should be, where they should run, these kinds of things. People use the models and people get affected by the models. And sometimes the people getting affected by the models can be pretty far removed from the people who are actually using the models. All right, so now that we hopefully have a little bit of common background and language, I'm going to turn to talking a little bit more specifically about using AI in research pipelines and what are some considerations and things you could keep in mind. So let's say you have a research project and you're considering using AI to help with your research. And maybe what this looks like is you have a research data set that you want to analyze and you're going to use AI to help you with your analysis. What are some of the things that I think you should think about in doing this? The first question that you should ask is this use of AI allowed? And this seems like a pretty, I don't know, something I shouldn't have to say, right? Like, if AI is not allowed, don't use AI. So, why am I saying this? Because a lot of people ignore this rule. And I can give you some very public examples of people ignoring this rule. So, this is a event that happened this year, just a couple months ago, which is one of the biggest machine learning conferences, so venue for computer science publications in machine learning. It's called the International Conference on Machine Learning, ICML. And in the computer science community, and I imagine other communities as well, there's a lot of debate right now over whether or not it's okay for reviewers to use AI in writing reviews of papers. And there's some people who say AI reviews are actually pretty good and we should use them, and why don't we leverage this useful tool to help our community? And there's other people who say we don't trust these models, and the whole point of peer review is that it's your peers and not black box technology. So what ICML decided to do is they just split their conference into two tracks. They said, all right, the community's divided, so we'll just also divide our conference. So they had two tracks, and what they said is you can submit your paper under policy A, and under policy A, you can't use AI in reviewing. And under policy B, you can use AI in reviewing, but you're still supposed to read the papers yourself. And the way that they enforce this is they said authors who submit to policy A, as an author submitting to this conference, you're also obligated to review for the conference. So if you want your paper to be reviewed by people not using AI, that means in writing your own reviews, you can't use AI either. So policy A papers also get reviewed by policy A authors. Okay. And what ultimately happened is the conference organizers applied watermarks to paper PDFs so they could tell in the generated review if this paper had been uploaded to an AI system, because they would see traces of that in the review. They put like secret text in the PDFs that would get outputted in the reviews. And based on this, they identified 497 papers whose authors used AI in the reviews, even though it was not allowed, even though they'd submitted these papers to policy A. So I think this whole story is wild, like the entire process, like that they decided to split the reviewing into two tracks, that people submitted papers to the track that was not allowed to use AI reviewing and then used AI anyway, and then that they actually caught it in this way by watermarking every single submission to the conference and then going back and checking, did those watermarks get outputted in the reviews? But the moral of the story for this talk is don't use AI when it's not allowed. Your paper will get rejected. I have another quick example of this, and you'll notice the date on this is June 2nd. I sent in my slides for this talk, and then I saw this post, and I was like, wait, I need to update it and add this. So this was another major machine learning conference. This one's called NeurIPS, probably the biggest machine learning conference. And they have a separate track for position papers. And they decided to implement this policy that was position papers should not use any AI in the writing. So AI for writing help in general is okay, but position papers, the whole point is this is supposed to be the author's position, so it should not be AI generated. And ultimately, as of yesterday, they announced they identified 178 papers submitted to the position track that used significant AI in writing, and they're now rejecting those papers, and that's 18% of the papers submitted to this track, which is a really high number. Right. Okay, so don't use AI if it's not allowed. So let's say you're not in one of these scenarios and you're looking at a use case where there's not some specific policy against the AI use that you have in mind. What are some of the other things that you need to consider? Well, if you're thinking about using AI, one of the first questions that I would ask is, do you actually need AI for the tasks that you're trying to do? And a first example of this are there other models, other tools, perhaps ones that are smaller, cheaper, and faster that can do the analysis that you want? I do a lot of work in computational social science, and this is a frequent question that I've had with social scientists interested in using AI to analyze their data is, if this is something you can accomplish with keyword counting, then count words, don't use AI, right? And perhaps there might not be other tools that can do what you want, but there might be other people who are maybe more informed and more reliable that could help you with the analysis that you want. So why might you choose these options over using AI? Well, there are kind of a lot of downsides to using AI. And one is that it's expensive in a lot of ways that can be hard to count. So not even just how much money are you spending on tokens, but what are the costs that went into the construction of these models from the beginning? So one area of this is the human labor costs that go into building AI. There's a lot of concerns that AI providers are not appropriately providing credit to people who created the data behind these models. And some of the cases where you can see this happening is in lawsuits that have been brought against these companies. So some of these have been around pre-training data containing copyright content that was then fed into these models, may now be reproduced by these models. Some of that is content that was perhaps explicitly released under non-commercial licenses that are now getting integrated into these commercial products. Another case where we've seen example of this is in data labelers or data workers. And so a lot of these companies, when they need labeled data, as we've seen in the construction pipeline, one of the places where they need labeled data that's pretty controversial and hard to get is they need labels on toxicity. If you want a model to not output things like hate speech, you need to explicitly remove that from the model training data, or you need to give the model examples of what not to output. So you need data sets where you have labeled this content is toxic. How do you get those data sets? You have to hire people to go through and read a lot of very toxic content and label it as toxic, right? And there's been some, mostly by in investigative journalist space, there's some research efforts on this as well. But efforts to show that like people are getting hired to do these jobs, getting paid very little, and these are really like mentally taxing jobs, right? The other concern about appropriately giving credit, this is the one that I've heard more recently, like really especially in the last month or so. And this is a concern that not around the data that's getting used to train and build these models, but actually the data that these models are kind of searching against and retrieving in order to provide answers to questions. So if you go to AI model of your choice, like even if you just go to Google and you get the AI overview, now a lot of times these models will give you citations for where they're pulling sources, right? They'll give you links to other websites. And what they're doing is they're pulling content from that website, showing you that content, and then linking the source that it came from. But if you don't actually click on that link, and I'm guessing most of us almost never click on these links, you're never actually going to that website. So you're not seeing the ads that are getting displayed there, and that website's not getting credited for the content. They're getting credited, but they're not getting the revenue for the content that they produce. So this is a kind of a big concern about these kinds of content providers online, that their content is now getting served to users in a way that they're not able to get any of the benefits from. AI is also expensive in terms of energy costs. This graph is from a recent report that I found, it was released in 2024 from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And the numbers they found were, as of 2023, data centers represent about 4.4% of total US energy consumption. And that doesn't sound that high, but it's more than double what it was in 2018. And their projection for the future is, depending on the trajectory that this growth takes, that could turn into 6% or 12% by 2028. And so now that's actually a pretty substantial portion of US energy usage. And not all data centers are being used for AI. They're used for all kinds of things. But their estimate is that by 2028, half of that usage is going to be AI. And one of the big challenges in understanding the energy costs of AI is that this information is generally not provided by AI providers. They actively don't disclose what the energy costs of training or using their models are. This report I linked at the bottom here, this was an MIT Technology Review article. They partnered with some researchers and tried to do some investigations on this. They came up with a number for one of the popular open source models. That's one of the larger open source models. Hard to say how size compares to some of the closed source models. But they estimate that about one query is equivalent to running a microwave for about 8 seconds. So you can imagine if you're repeatedly querying the model to answer your question and having a long-running conversation, this can start to add up pretty fast. But in general, these numbers are pretty hard to estimate because companies just don't release the data. All right. So if you do need to use AI, you want to use AI, it's allowed, and maybe you decide that there aren't better alternatives, and you really do want to use AI for the project you're considering. Some of the things that you can do is to try to pay attention to the transparency of the providers that you're using, particularly these development pipelines. Like, what do they release about the data that the model was trained on? What do they say about energy costs? And right now, I wish that I could have had a guidance of like, this provider does these things well and this one doesn't. And I don't think we really have gold star examples of any really truly transparent and strong performing model providers. But I think the way we get that transparency is it has to be demanded by consumers. So something to keep in mind. Other things that you need to consider if you're using AI is what risks might you be assuming in your usage of these tools? And so there's two that I'm going to highlight. The first one is privacy, and the second one is accuracy. And again, I'll kind of mostly give you examples. Well, sort of. So on the privacy side, this is something I think that there's been increasing awareness of in the last year or so, but not necessarily action on. So if you go, this is an example from OpenAI, but if you look at policies of other models, they're all pretty similar. If you go and read the AI terms of use, they have a section on personal data, and they describe what data they collect when you use their tools. And what they say is that data you provide into our services, including your prompts and other content that you upload, such as files, images, audio, video, SOAR characters, and data from connected services, which is actually really quite a lot of data. They collect all of this. And there's nothing secret or illegal about it, right? It's explicitly and very clearly disclosed in their terms of use that nobody reads. What do they do with the data that they collect? Well, certainly they store it. But the other thing that they explicitly disclose is we may use content you provide to us to improve our services, for example, to train the models that power ChatGPT. So they collect your data and they train on it, and we know this because they tell us that we do it. There are some variations here. So depending on what plan you have, like you can opt out, depending on the provider and your plan, of having your content used for training. That's typically not opting out of having the content being collected. It's typically still being collected unless you have some particular contract around what the actual data retention policy is. So why is this something that matters? It's been well documented that AI models leak training data. Arguably, this is explicitly what they're supposed to do, right? They're supposed to reproduce the content they've been trained on. But it's been shown that this can happen specifically around content that can be privacy invasive. So this first example is from a research paper that showed you can extract training data examples from large language models. So this is focusing on text data, and that includes examples that have things like individuals' names, email addresses, phone numbers, and other kinds of personal information. The second example is a follow-up paper by the same group, and what they showed is basically the same thing is also true for image generation models, that images these models have been trained on, you can get them to almost exactly reproduce the training data images. So what this means is that data that you upload to an AI system, unless you're pretty confident in the terms of service, and I will say I use HopGPT for data that is sensitive because I trust JHU's lawyers. You can make your own judgments on that. This might be shown to other people, right? Not only have you given it to OpenAI, if they train on it, it's going to be visible to other people as well. And more concretely, in general, if you're conducting research, you're working with healthcare data, you can't upload this data to just any AI system that you want. You need to be careful about the actual terms of the agreement. So other considerations around accuracy beyond privacy. And this one, again, I'll kind of just give you a couple of specific examples. I think it's been pretty pretty well advertised that AI models hallucinate, produce content that's incorrect. I think AI models themselves admit this now, right? They all have this little, how have companies solved this problem? Well, they haven't. They've just added a little disclaimer in light text at the bottom of all of their systems that acknowledge you should double check responses, and they just put the burden back on you to say you need to make sure the output's correct. But at the same time, AI models seem, we know this can happen, but AI models seem pretty good and pretty useful. So do we actually really need to worry about these errors? Like, do they actually have impactful consequences when trying to use AI in research pipelines? And here again, I have a couple of examples. And the first one focuses on a code generation example. And I'll walk you through briefly walk you through the little story of what happened. So I have a PhD student in my lab, and I'm a computer scientist, so these are all PhD students in computer science, right? And he was working on a project on adjusting for model errors in large-scale data analysis. So he wrote code for this project, and what code done is runs our analysis pipeline that does this error correction. And he did all the initial coding for this himself. He ran it on our initial data set, and it worked pretty well. We got pretty good results, and we were like, great, this seems like it's publishable. So in computer science, where we're developing methodology, we always have to show things work across multiple data sets, or it's usually not publishable. So he processed a second data set, he ran the code on the second data set, and it didn't work. And we spent a couple of meetings trying to figure out what was different about these two data sets. Like, was the starting model worse? Was the data, we had more data, less data, some difference in size? Like, what do we think? Why do we think this is not working here? And he came back after this, and he figured out what the problem was. And it was between running the code on the first data set and the second data set, he used an AI model to refactor the code. So not generating the code from scratch, right? It's all code that he'd already written. It was already there. All he asked the model to do is just like clean it up a little, rearrange it, parse some pieces into other functions. And what the model did is, it's a little bit blurry because it's a screenshot of the real code, but what he started with is this, in the top is the original formula that we're using in our analysis. And the model added this if-else logic, which we didn't need. Like, we're running the system we want to run. We didn't need alternatives, but fine, model added if-else logic. And particularly, it defaulted to the first line of this if statement. So you don't need to know anything about code to be able to see that, like, this line and this line are the same, and this line is not the same. That's just changing the formula of what we were trying to run, right? So, and something I want to emphasize about this example is, first, this was a PhD student in computer science who'd written all the original code himself. So he went back and he found this error because he just read the code and he could tell what was wrong because he knew what the code was supposed to be. But if you're generating code where you don't know what the code is supposed to be, you don't know how to write code, how are you going to catch an error like this? The other thing is that this is a really recent example. This was in, I want to say, end of March. And so we're not looking at like, well, last year's models make these kinds of mistakes, but this year's models are better. Like, no, this is this year's models, right? Okay, so this is one example. Second example that I'm going to use is around hallucinated citations. And I'm not sure how prevalent this has been in other fields, but it's been like a huge problem across computer science, specifically in the last year, has sort of exploded. And there's data behind this, which is what I'm going to show you. So this is the full paper here is linked at the bottom, but this is a paper that did a really thorough review of papers published recently at natural language processing, it's my main field, conferences. And they took the three, I would say, biggest NLP conferences, and they did this across 2024 and 2025. And these conferences are like NACLs in March, ACLs in July, EMLPs in November. So we're just like moving through about 3-month intervals here. And what they found is in NACL 2024, they found 2 papers that had hallucinated citations, which was a pretty small percentage of papers published at the conference. But the most recent conference at the time they ran this analysis, they found 3.7% of papers had hallucinated citations, which is pretty high, right? I mean, it's a big conference. It's 154 papers. So that's kind of wild. And I feel like I'm giving you a lot of examples of AI problems in computer science, so I'm a little bit making my own field look bad here. But I do think my own field should know better. Like, we study hallucinations. Like, People should not be doing this. Um, all right, some more examples of this. I have a student who submitted a paper to a workshop a few months ago, and when we got the decision notification from the workshop, one of the things they noted in here that I thought was very interesting is they noted we ran hallucination checks on all of the submissions to the workshop, and we just rejected 15% of papers for having hallucinated citations. Um, at the time that we got the email from this workshop we had submitted to, I was in the process of reviewing submissions to the workshop that I was organizing, which is a workshop on natural language processing and computational social science. And inspired by this email, I realized that we had to do hallucination citation checks in our own papers. And this was something that I felt very strongly about. We don't want papers in our proceedings that are citing content that's not real. We want to maintain standards of what our workshop considered publishable. So I ran a citation checker on submissions to our workshops. I found hallucinated citations in about 10% of submissions. And these, I believe the other two examples I showed the students as well. But this is something where I have no doubts about this. Like I went through and manually checked these examples, and they were absolutely references to papers that don't exist. And I have an example of one. So this was a hallucinated citation in a paper submitted to our workshop. And the reason that I'm showing you this example is I think it's important to realize how hard it is to catch these kinds of mistakes. So if we look at this example, these are real people. I know these people, they do work together. And so it's totally believable that they published a paper together. The title of the paper is a topic that they work on, so I believe that too. The conference is a real conference. If a student handed me a paper that had this citation and I was just reading the paper to check it over, I would not have noticed that this was wrong. But unfortunately for the authors who submitted a paper with citation, the first author here was one of the co-organizers of the workshop. So I just asked her, did you write this paper or anything that possibly could be mistaken for this paper? And paper does not exist. Okay, I have one other example here. So this example I think is pretty sneaky. They can get even sneakier. And so this was another example from a submission to our workshop. And this is citation that they had in the paper they submitted. This is the citation for a paper that actually exists. Oh, do you have a question? Go ahead. Yeah, so I just kind of found, well, this is an interesting story. So we actually spent a little while trying to build one. Eventually I found one that just someone else in the research community had built and put online. The organizers of the ACL this year, they ran citation checkers on the proceedings, and I think they actually released the tool that they use, which was probably a little better than what we had kind of found. But broadly, the technology behind them is they just search a bunch of APIs for, like they search like Semantic Scholar, some of them pull Google Scholar, and a couple of other reference places that provide paper citations, and then they do some level of like fuzzy matching, allowing for there might be a typo or something like that. And then if they can't find if they can't find a plausible reference for the paper, then they flag it as a hallucination. When I was running the checks over our workshop proceedings, the tool had like many false positives. So books it could never find. So there are a lot of instances of people citing books and it didn't find those. And so like I would have to go through and find the book and be like, no, this is real. And then yeah, other things were like tools that weren't actually published papers. They were toolkits, and so those kinds of things it couldn't find. So there are a lot of false positives. Yeah, so I don't have a specific, like, we just searched and we're like hallucination checker and found one, yeah, that we could run locally.
Could you please repeat the question?
Oh, sure. Yes, I can do that. Yeah, the question was what tool do you use for checking for hallucinated citations? Um, right. So this example, interestingly, my tool did not catch. We also didn't catch it either. This was actually caught by a reviewer, which I was extremely impressed by. But what you can see is the error is actually only the first names of the authors are wrong. Everything else is correct, but all of the first names of all of the authors are wrong. Um, and this I actually think is less problematic. Like I wouldn't desk reject a paper over this. Like this is something that it's a real paper. They made a claim. They backed up the claim with a real thing. They just sort of had an error. But it still looks sloppy. Like you don't really want to submit work like this. And I can guess with reasonably high confidence what I think happened here, because the paper that had this error, they had this problem for like 4 or 5 references. Probably they had the references in a format where there was last name, first initial. And then when they were submitting to this conference, maybe they had prepared that for a different venue and they were resubmitting and they used AI to revise, reformat their reference list to a format that used full first names, and model doesn't know what the real first names are, so it just produced fake first names for all of the authors. So after this experiment with our workshop, I sent a carefully worded message to my own students that basically said, "I trust you wouldn't do this, but also like, I better not catch you doing this." I think how do we stop these problems? I mean, we have to train people that citations are not just rubber stamping on your paper. They actually matter, and the integrity of them is important for the integrity of the work you're submitting. Okay. So these are some kind of specific things to be careful about if you're using AI in research processes. And this is thinking more about the day-to-day, like how that might this affect the work specifically that you're submitting. One of the other things that I think is relevant here is what's the broader impact that AI usage in general is having on science as a whole. And there's been a couple of studies that have tried to look at this. It's pretty difficult to study, but there are a couple of examples now. And this was a paper, this was published in Science last year. And what they looked at is they took archives of papers and they used a kind of automated system to identify if the paper writing had components of AI writing. So this was specifically like AI was used to help write the paper. That's how they were inferring AI usage. And what they found is that papers that authors of papers that used AI in writing led to more productivity. Like these authors submitted more preprints after they started adopting AI. But they had this finding that's a little bit nuanced, which is the AI written preprints had higher language complexity. So AI wrote things that sounded complicated and fluent and, deep and interesting, but they had lower rates of getting accepted for publication, right? They're looking at preprints, so they look at was that preprint actually published somewhere? And so what you potentially got out of these AI models was language that sounded complicated, but didn't actually really improve the underlying science, right? In non-AI preprints, there was the opposite trend that higher language complexity was associated with higher rate of publication. Like better written papers, when they didn't use AI, were more likely to be published. And one of the caveats I think here is that they're trying to infer was AI used to write this paper or not, and those judgments are questionably reliable. So we have to consider that in these results. But they did find pretty clear trends in these cases. So there is another study that looked at use of AI in research papers, and here they're not trying to measure was the paper written with AI. They're looking at does this paper talk about using AI? Like is this a data analysis, and they say we used this AI tool to do the data analysis. So they're looking at papers that are kind of actually really using AI in doing the research itself, not just the kind of research process. And the trend that they found is that AI, similarly, they found benefits for individual scientists. So researchers who adopted AI tended to publish more often, and their papers got more cited than researchers who were not using AI. But they found a reduced focus in topics. So this figure, they took all of the papers and they projected them. They did some quantitative metrics, but this is the kind of more qualitative version where they projected them into a semantic space, and you can see the AI papers cover, a smaller portion of that region than the non-AI papers. So there's sort of benefits to individual scientists, but it's potentially coming at the cost of research diversity across the whole field. So I think this is actually very complicated because you have this, you're individually by these results incentivized to use AI, but it's potentially not great for your community. Um, One of the other issues with using AI in research is risks of plagiarism. Um, and you can imagine this maybe not, but like maybe is a factor in some of the results in the previous studies as well. If you're seeing like redaction and how kind of novel and original ideas are, maybe some of that's getting driven by what you're getting out of the AI is sort of increasingly reusing ideas that have already been done. So this was a study in which they used AI to generate research proposals. So effectively for hypothesis generation, that's a task a lot of people have been pitching for AI as an AI for science use case. And they had people go through and validate do they think this idea is original or is it plagiarized? And what they found in the AI generated ideas was about 24% of them were verified plagiarism. And the way they did this verification is they had an expert review. Does this paper seem to plagiarize? What's the paper plagiarizes? And then they went back to that source paper, those authors, and asked, like, is this plagiarizing your work? So that's what they mean by verified. Even the potential rate they speculate might actually be even higher because they didn't verify all of the ones that they could have tried to verify. And a sort of potential criticism of this, which is fair, is that, well, a lot of research is sort of, taking an idea from here and there and putting it together, and that's not necessarily plagiarism. So is this really, is sort of having some overlap in ideas really that big a problem? So they also tried this with actual published papers that were written by people before these AI tools became popular, and they don't find this kind of plagiarism there, right? AI plagiarizes and people usually don't. Okay, so I've given you kind of a lot of cautionary examples about why we should be careful about integrating AI in research. Wanted to end with something like a little bit more positive, which is when do I think it actually does make sense to use AI, and what are guidelines under which I would explicitly kind of encourage my students to use AI. And I'll give you two examples of places that my lab has been using AI a fair amount, and yeah, so this specific examples, I mean, my students do a lot of things with AI, but these are ones that consistently we've been doing across projects, and I think they work well. So first example is building annotation interfaces. So in a lot of my work, it's fairly common for us to have some data that's produced by a model or predictions made by a model or something to this effect, and we need people to go through and annotate, like, are they correct or not, or do they look good? And the way that we have often done this, if we're running a large study, we might do this through some kind of online platform, but we might do a kind of smaller version where we just sort of ask people to help do some initial judgments of the data. And what we used to do this when I was a student is I would basically build these giant Excel spreadsheets and I'd just like put all the data in a spreadsheet and I'd ask people to go through and like label in the columns. Now, what my students do is they just build a custom front-end annotation interface where they show the person the data and they ask the person to label, is this right or not? And it's a usually fairly simple front end, often in HTML. And this is basically all through AI generated code that's prompting build me an interface for this and some modifications, some editing, and so on. And this is usually a much better experience for people trying to label the data. And I'm actually curious to run a study to try to do this, but I suspect it leads to fewer annotation errors, like less someone actually accidentally put the wrong thing in the wrong cell. It would be interesting to see if that's actually true. And in this example, this is something that I don't really have any worries about using AI to generate interfaces like this because the outputs of the model are not central to the correctness of the work. We care about the annotations themselves, so we need to make sure that the annotation interface is like correctly saving and storing the annotations. Like that matters, but the actual exact design of the interface, it doesn't really matter. We used to do this in a spreadsheet. It's just a little nicer and cleaner to do it this way. The other way that I judge this is if I were giving a talk on this paper and someone asked me how the annotation interface worked, I couldn't answer that question, but I don't care that I can't answer that question. I don't think that's important for me to be able to explain to make the work valid. So another example where we've been doing this, and this is actually a little more personal, is generally like formatting things, formatting plots and tables. And this is a specific example. So this is a nice figure from one of our recent papers that was originally made by an undergrad student who was working with us. And I'm a computer scientist, so we do everything in Python, but her major was psychology, and so she does everything in R, and I don't really know R, right? I struggle my way through other people's R code when I have to. And she made this nice plot, and I wanted to make some changes to the plot, but it's in a language I don't know that well. And so I used AI to do generating changes to the plot. And this is something where I don't worry about the outputs because it's very easy for me to verify, is this correct or not? I know what the original figure looked like. I know what it's supposed to look like. I can tell if my changes were correct or not, or if the model like drastically changed how the plot was supposed to look. So to summarize a little bit more broadly, what are the places where I generally encourage my students to use AI? So one is when it's clearly the best tool for the job. A second is when we're confident that the privacy considerations are not an issue. So either we're using JHU approved systems with the level of data privacy we need to enforce for the data we're working with, or we're not working with sensitive data. A third, and this is the two examples I just gave you, one for each of these, is when the outputs are not central for the correctness of the work, or they're very easy for us to verify. And then a fourth one is that I didn't talk about as much today because I think it's probably not as relevant for this audience. But a fourth one is when you wouldn't learn something valuable by doing it yourself. So an example of this I think really comes up more in the education context. But for example, as a PhD student, you also are supposed to be learning. And if implementing the thing is good for your learning, even if AI could have done it faster, it still may be worth doing it yourself because you'll understand the process better. You'll be able to answer questions about it better. And that's sort of doubly true when you're taking a class. So this, I think, is an evolving list. I'm happy to hear other people's thoughts on this. But we've had in my lab a couple of conversations about when do we think people should and should not be using AI in their research, and roughly this is what I've come up with as some checks to think about. Okay, and I will stop there.
Encourage your students to use it to for proofreading everything better. Or you say once you write the paper, don't let AI touch it.
I generally don't have objections to proofreading and editing use cases. I think a lot of times they're useful. I think I have noticed like I don't necessarily sit down with all of my students and go through exactly where they used AI in what parts of the process, but I have noticed that paper drafts I get have better quality writing than they used to, and I assume this is coming from AI editing. I think the one of the biggest concerns I have about AI editing is like the citation problem, and generally ensuring that the content is still correct. And I think it's when you use AI for editing work that you've done, you can read it and be confident like that you'll catch mistakes. And it's harder to do with these hallucinated citations, like just reading it, you might not see it. So I think that's yeah, maybe where I would be more cautious. But yeah, I mean, I put this example I put as a plot. Like one of the other ones, we write all our papers in LaTeX, and LaTeX tables are just like horrible. And I feel like using AI to help redesign your tables, it's like that's an editing thing that I think is very reasonable. Oh, sorry, I was supposed to read the question. Okay, I'll repeat the next question. Yeah. So to repeat the question, uh, broadly, how when people have time shortages and competing priorities and are inclined to use AI to take shortcuts, how do you convey where that can be problematic? I think it's hard, and in some settings, it's really like an education question. I mean, this is really the crisis that's happening in classrooms, right? I really see the computer science perspective, but like code generation is so good, and most of our homework assignments you can AI generate now. And so, do we rewrite all of our like how are people redesigning their courses to account for this is an ongoing challenge. And I think some of it is we need to train people in terms of like what in research integrity means and prioritizing like correctness of the work and that it was done properly. And that's harder when you have a collaborator who's not getting trained anymore and they're the one taking shortcuts. Like then you can't kind of attribute it to training. But I think that's one of the core things. I mean, this is some of the conversations I've had with my students is we care about the correctness of the work and not just the volume of the work, and they should not be doing things like trying to take shortcuts because I don't want my lab submitting papers that I think are low quality. And that's something I try to instill in my students. Yeah, I don't know if I have much better solutions than that. I mean, I think these kinds of examples of here when things go wrong, when you take shortcuts, like more publicizing of those kinds of examples is often useful. And yeah, that's one of the reasons I like this code generation fiasco that I shared of like this seems like a really benign use of AI, and it was not benign in this case.
We, we both understand. We have so many incredibly medical students coming through doing research, undergraduate students, right? But they're just, and so getting them to embrace that. Being a whole certain things we training to blind.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. Just for the benefit of people on Zoom, the concern that the system seems to be training us to blindly trust and is not necessarily incentivizing people to understand what they don't know. Yeah, I think it's some of the challenges like AI providers want people to use AI. And so their incentives are the opposite, or like use AI even if you don't know the details.
But I really like your lecture very much. It was today, you pretty clear what I do my work. And going back to the business, I had a friend that was going to talk to me, doesn't really know art, this whole paper rewriting R, and what I thought was most useful in terms of what we need. Yeah, it helped. I went through paper really quickly, and key values were very congruent with confidence interval, and I broke it down into specific things that they could understand from their work. Like they don't know what that is. And I'm like, where's that come from? Where's that data come from? Where's the data going on? At some point, they can draw the link from what they know and what they don't know, the first link comes from what they've worked on. And that to me seems really helpful. Because in personal examples like that, yeah, they're like, oh yeah, I'll not make that mistake. I'll check. Maybe I'll use the AI to check for them to ask the AI. Really go step by step. I think honestly doesn't beat the job with 800 participation weeks still work at fellow Angus. Really lay down like how exactly we prompt. What are some like good research factories help from and minimize the error that the AI statement. That means in the first practice. And then also know where your knowledge depth is and how much stuff isn't. And SOS, IUDs, and stuff like that. Because I don't want to spin the wheel with AI and give the stuff. Vehicles, suggestions that I
Yeah, thank you. That sounds great. I think um, trying to think of how to recap for people on Zoom. I think broadly there are some encouraging examples of people using AI for research and going back through the paper and understanding where their knowledge gaps are. And that is something that's like possible to do and also possible to encourage people to do. Yeah, one of the kind of proxies that I sort of pitch to my students in terms of these kinds of guidelines is if someone asks you if someone asks you you give a talk on this paper and someone asks you a question, can you answer the question or not based on how you used AI? And does that matter? So if they ask, if you propose an algorithm and they ask you some specific detail, like how did you come up with this term in the algorithm? And you can't answer that. That's pretty bad, right? You're not going to get a job if that's a job talk. But if they ask you, like, how did you make that shade of blue on the annotation interface? I don't think it matters. And so that's maybe one way to think about how do you tell if you trust the correctness of the outputs is like, if someone asks you about this, can you explain it? And if you can't, then you probably have a problem.
I think you're good answer. But I think that would be what code that you find when the if else was how would how would that person use it and then fix it? Or do you think that is kind of an answer that how we did it, found it, or how we fixed it? And how do you help your future students take that experience and they use AI?
Yeah, so the question was about the specific code generation example, and sort of what happened and how did the student do this. I don't know exactly. We'd have to check with the student, but my understanding of what happened is like he wrote the code, he gave the code to the model and prompt the model to refactor it. So refactoring generally means can mean a variety of things, but one way to think about it is maybe you originally wrote the code as just one 300-line block of code, and you want to actually break that into separate functions. So you have each function do a specific task, and that's sort of generally cleaner style of programming and more recommended. What people do in industry, not always what people do in research. And so he prompted the model to do some cleanup and refactoring. Then he just ran the code. I think I could be misremembering, but I think he ran the code on the new data set and the numbers didn't look right. I think at that point he reran it on the old data set and also saw that the numbers had changed. And then that's like what made it clear that there was an issue because we knew that it was working on that data. I could be misremembering that. It's possible that after that he just like once we didn't know exactly what was wrong, he went through and read the code base. But this is also something like, he's spent a lot of time staring at and learning these formulas, and so it was easy to recognize that this is the wrong formula because he knew all the literature behind it and knew what it was supposed to be. So I think that's probably how he did it. In terms of how do you fix that? Like,
For futures, how do you use the experience?
yeah, I mean, I think one is just a sort of tale of being cautious. And I think it's especially a tale of being cautious about things that are like central to the work. This is sort of the core method that we're proposing. And so that's really got to be right. I think there are other things you could do to try to reduce this. Like you could write tests for your code so that if you change your code and it doesn't pass the test anymore, then you know that something is wrong. Um, I think another option is like after you AI refactor, you should recheck the code manually if you didn't write test, though testing is better practice. Another might be don't AI refactor your most important script. Like maybe refactor your data processing scripts if you think that's not as not as central, but maybe not your like core algorithm. Yeah, I mean, I think in practice, like probably rechecking the outputs is more what we would do. And these kinds of errors, like humans make mistakes in writing code too. So we're not we're not in totally uncharted territory here in terms of how do you figure out that there might be a bug in your code. It's usually you had an idea, you ran the experiment, it didn't work as you expected, and your options are your idea was bad or your code is wrong. And like usually you want to find that the code is wrong before you throw out the idea. So yeah. Yeah, so I guess the question is with better citation, like can can better AI fix the hallucinated citation problem? Um, I think so. It certainly is possible to fix the manifestation of the problem. Like, it's possible to have better tools that do some automated checking. Like, you could imagine a workflow like you AI generate your paper, you run your citation checker, and then it finds some fake citations, so you fix those, and you've technically solved the manifestation of the problem that I'm showing. But I think that there's a broader problem of you shouldn't be citing sources if you don't know what's in those sources. Like giving a citation to a paper is not just a check mark that you need to have papers cited in your paper. It's because you're trying to show how your work compares against work that precedes yours, where does it fit into the broader research landscape, and generally, if you're citing a paper, you should have read the paper that you cited. Like it's in this check of if someone asks you about this, could you answer this? If you cited a paper in your work and someone asks you a question relating to that paper and you didn't read the paper, like I think that makes you look bad. You should have actually read what you cited. So I think the kind of problem of can you fix wrong citations? Like that's a technology problem, but enforcing that you should have some integrity in your research, that's not really solved with different technology.
So, starting I started to do a lot of stuff on this first reaction was to, look at things that some and that I start to see like even though the person is ownership of this code, I start to see like well, the critical thinking level is actually increasing. So in your example, even if you say I ethically do the research, see, do you think that the critical thinking is also increasing?
Yeah, so that's a great question, which is like, is use of AI decline in critical thinking? I don't think we have convincing like research studies that have shown that either way. I mean, anecdotally, I certainly think people are learning less when they're using AI. From the educator perspective, this is something that colleagues in my department have discussed a lot. Like what we see happening is people submitting homeworks and doing fine on the homeworks and then doing very poorly on exams. And the theory, like some of the theory is it's not just that people are like I wouldn't some of it is people sort of actively cheating. Some of it is people through interactions with AI may read the outputs and think that they understood it, but that's a different level than being able to implement something. And that's also a different level than being able to explain it to someone else. And so they may not even be recognizing that they didn't actually learn what they thought they learned until they do poorly on the exam. But I think that's pretty anecdotal. Like this is just us speculating why are people doing badly on exams. And this is one of the theories. Uh, I think that's like my concern that if you're leaning heavily on AI, you're not actually learning and thinking is sort of what motivates my point number 4 here. That you perhaps want to do things by yourself, even if it's slower, because it might be beneficial in the long run. But yeah, I don't know that, like, I think this is something that's really hard to study. I'm not even really sure how you would design a study for it. But it's certainly like an area of concern, and could be something that's happening.
So interestingly, I station. These students. And so it's interesting to me, I have sort of the same thing, it's sort of dumbing down. And I think a lot of it comes from who's running the lab, you know, how rigorous you are with transferring the relative value of this tool, which is it's incredibly simple, right? Um, and so understanding that you should treat it like your crazy genius uncle who's, 78, sometimes that's something you can get out at Thanksgiving dinner. And so so I think a lot of this needs to come from leadership in the labs. And I've been a little bit disappointed actually with the lack of guidance coming from our institutions, particularly Hopkins is kind of slow to put forth official stances on these kinds of things because it's difficult. But I think that's something that we need to keep in mind is to that is a lab or overseas.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great comment. Comment was broadly like usage around AI, guidelines on when it's useful and when it's not, potentially need to come from like lab PIs and at a higher level, it would be nice if Hopkins offered some more institution level guidance on navigating like what are potentially good use cases and what are use cases that are doing things like declining critical thinking. Yeah, I think this is great. I'm super interested in doing this. I've been working on a proposal around like understanding usage and how do we turn this into guidelines. And I think it's hard. A lot of it is we just don't, we have so little data on like what people are actually doing with these tools. And so it's hard to establish like what do we think is still important. Um, yeah, and there's an argument that there are some things that like maybe we don't need to emphasize as much anymore. Like I spent one of the skills that I really well established as a PhD student is cutting papers to the page limit. Like I'd write the first version of the paper and it'd be 10 pages long and then I'd have to cut it down to 8 pages. And I was really proud of my ability to like reduce a paper by 25% without cutting out core content. And I don't think that skill is as important anymore. Like AI is pretty good at suggesting like here is the same thing in fewer words. And
Um, recommendations that we're different.
Yeah, so the question is, are there guidelines or recommendations around like when to use which AI tool? I don't have any core, um, I don't really have a great source for this. I think so. So this is actually varied. I mean, for a while with releases of new models, companies do output some kind of a blog post, and it used to be a paper, and now it's usually more of like an ad about the tool. And that's at least some starting point that gives, at some high level, how did they train this tool differently than predecessor ones, and what do they think that makes it good for? So I think that's probably where I would start, but I don't really have a great, I don't know that there's a great resource for navigating this landscape. I think releases of new systems are pretty frequent, so it would also be pretty hard to keep a data set, like a data source like that up to date. Certainly there's a lot of like anecdotal, like people will say, I like this one, and then other people will try it. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have better guidelines than that. There are some companies that have explicitly tried to be more transparent and have released like more detailed information about exactly what the models were trained on. So that's useful to see. in practice, those are not actually really the top performing systems. Like they haven't caught on because they're just not actually quite as good. Yeah, so I don't know. Like, yeah, sort of whatever's released about the model is at least worth reading, but um, it's not always as much detail as you would like.
So great for your.
Thank you.
And then. You. Knowledge. And then I will also invite you to join me for lunch right outside. That's the other in person. So, and thank you for all this doing online. We also. Thanks. There. Yeah, yeah, wonderful. Yeah, it's so.
Yeah.
Yeah.